Callum Briggs had been driving himself to work sites since he was 27, first as a junior structural engineer with a regional firm in Lethbridge, then as a licensed independent consultant working out of the spare bedroom of a house he'd bought with his wife Joanna before she got sick. He was 49 now. Joanna had been gone 8 years. Their daughter, Nadia, Nadi, to everyone who'd known her since she was 12, was 17 and in her final year at Archbishop MacDonald, and Callum dropped her off every morning on his way to whatever site had called him that week. He wasn't a flashy consultant. No website, no case studies, no LinkedIn endorsements. He had a phone, a truck, a set of instruments he'd calibrated and recalibrated for 2 decades, and a reputation among Alberta project managers, usually earned the hard way, through someone else's bad experience, that Callum Briggs caught things. Specifically, he caught load distribution failures, the kind that looked fine in a computer model and turned critical under sustained real-world stress, temperature swing, and the repeated vibration a highway bridge deck absorbs over years. The Crowchild connector was an Aldred job, a modular pedestrian and light vehicle bridge over a drainage canal in northwest Calgary, part of a $40 million city infrastructure contract. A site foreman named André Pelletier had called Callum directly, not through the company, because André had worked with him on a Bow River footbridge 4 years earlier and trusted what Callum said, more than what the drawings said when the two disagreed. Callum spent 3 hours on site and found a lateral load distribution flaw in the primary support bracket assembly. The brackets were fabricated to spec. The spec itself was wrong. Under standard load, the assembly held. Under wind shear above 40 kilometers an hour, combined with concentrated foot traffic at midspan, the exact condition a busy pedestrian bridge sees during a high school lunch break or a community event. The connection between the bracket plate and the anchor collar would fatigue faster than the design accounted for. He filed the report and invoiced the company for 3 hours of assessment and 1 replacement specification, $275. Renata Voss had been Aldred Construction's COO for 6 years. 41. Direct. Efficient in the way people become efficient after a decade of managing projects that demand hundreds of decisions a day and can't afford to have any of them revisited. She'd built her name delivering the company's larger contracts on time and within margin, which mattered, because her father Douglas had built Aldred over 40 years with more attention to quality than to margin, a disposition that had nearly sunk the company twice, and that Renata had spent 6 years correcting. She hadn't been told about André's call to Callum. She'd been told about the invoice by a procurement coordinator who'd flagged it for having no purchase order and no contractor file. She verified there was no authorization on record and told him to decline it and send the standard non-authorized vendor notice. She never read the report attached to it. What she didn't know, what the coordinator couldn't have known, was that the bracket specification Callum had just flagged contained an error, identified once before, 12 years earlier, in the original development of the modular support system that had been the foundation of Aldred's bridge division ever since. That system was the Aldred Integrated Load Frame, filed as a proprietary engineering standard in 2013 and built into every modular bridge Aldred had produced since. The original patent application named its inventor only by the initials CB, a notation that had survived 2 renewals, with the paper trail connecting those initials to an actual person arranged, whether by accident or design, so that it led nowhere. Douglas Aldred, 74, wasn't supposed to be reviewing patent documentation. His cardiologist had been clear about cognitive stress, and Renata had been equally clear about him staying out of operational files. But he still had evenings when he sat in his study in Elbow Park and opened old project files the way other men reopen books they loved, looking for something they hadn't noticed the first time. He'd opened the integrated load frame file after a dinner 2 weeks earlier, where an engineer he respected mentioned, offhand, that Aldred's Bridge division was the only company in Western Canada using a particular bracket anchor geometry, one the engineer recognized from a graduate research paper a decade and a half old and had never seen in commercial use. Douglas hadn't thought much of it that night. He'd thought about little else since. He'd called Patricia Shen, an intellectual property attorney he'd retained 8 months earlier, quietly, without telling Renata. After a routine portfolio review, turned up a filing date on the integrated load frames design files that didn't match the project timeline by 14 months. Patricia had been chasing the person behind CB ever since. The Crowchild service record, uploaded to Aldred's contractor management system, the same evening Andre filed the inspection request, carried Callum's full name, his consulting registration number, and his address in East Calgary. Patricia found her match before Douglas finished reading the file. Callum was in his garage at 7:30 the next morning, going through drawings for a Red Deer retaining wall project when the knock came. He opened the door in his work clothes and looked at Douglas Aldred and the attorney beside him and said, without much surprise, that he'd put the kettle on. They sat at his kitchen table. Nadie's backpack was on the chair by the door. A permission slip for a school trip to Edmonton hung on the fridge under a hockey stick magnet. Douglas set a certified check on the table between the mugs without ceremony and said he was sorry it had taken this long, that the figure represented unpaid royalties across 12 years of production, plus accumulated interest and penalties for the misfiled patent. Callum looked at more zeros than he'd ever seen made out to him, then at Douglas, and asked how many structures were currently built on his design. 26 bridges, Douglas said without pausing, across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, worth just under $200 million combined. Callum absorbed the number the way a man absorbs something that doesn't surprise him but changes the weight of the room anyway. He asked to see the audit methodology and the original filing. Patricia walked him through it. The payment, she said, had been calculated conservatively and came with no non-disclosure condition. She'd argued for that specifically, and Douglas hadn't fought her on it. She also placed a settlement finalization form on the table, acknowledging the payment as satisfying the royalty claim. It didn't waive other claims, she was careful to note. It was scoped to the audit. Callum read it twice, set it beside the check, and didn't pick up a pen. His objection was measured. The form said nothing about restoring his name to the design record, and nothing about assessing the safety of the bracket assembly currently in the ground. The same assembly he'd flagged 2 days earlier. The same flaw that existed because a load redundancy in his original design had been stripped out of the commercial version to save on fabrication. Renata had arrived behind her father's car and was listening from the hallway, coat still on. She said he was attaching new conditions to a settlement that was already more than fair, and that refusing to sign looked like someone angling for a bigger number. Callum studied her for a moment. If money were the concern, he said, the form would already be signed. What concerned him was 26 structures carrying public traffic on a version of his load frame missing its secondary redundancy, a backup load path through the anchor collar that would engage automatically if the primary bracket began to fatigue under uneven stress. It had been cut from production because it added $47 a unit. The result was a system that behaved under standard loading and turned dangerous under the specific combination of wind, concentrated foot traffic, and bracket fatigue that time and heavy use reliably produce. The Crowchild connector was already showing early fatigue signs, 4 months into service. Douglas said the installation should be suspended, pending an independent review. Renata said Crowchild was tied to a city milestone with a penalty clause running $400,000 a week, and that suspending it would mean explanations she wasn't prepared to give the city's infrastructure office. Kyle Renner, Aldred's VP of Engineering for 9 years, had been tipped off by Renata's assistant about where her father's car had gone. He arrived at 8:45, and when Renata stepped outside to take a call, he fell into step beside her and mentioned, in the reasonable tone of a man offering useful context, that Callum Briggs had been terminated from Aldred 12 years ago for removing proprietary files, and that the design he was now claiming to have invented was the same one he'd been fired for stealing. Kyle brought the personnel file the next afternoon, a physical folder, the kind that carries authority just by being paper. Inside was a termination summary describing Callum as a contract engineer dismissed after an investigation into removed documentation and deleted server data, a statement from a facilities coordinator confirming he'd left the building with an unlogged bag, a legal hold notice, later closed without prosecution, which Kyle presented as the company's generosity rather than as a sign the case had never held together. He told Renata privately that her father was 74 and 3 years into health trouble that had left him susceptible to stories, offering a chance to fix an old mistake, and that the audit Patricia represented had been commissioned under Douglas's personal authority without board notice. Callum's account, delivered at a meeting Patricia arranged and Renata attended reluctantly, differed in almost every particular. He'd been on contract with Aldred's Bridge Division 2.5 years when he caught a failure mode during a load test on a prototype connector in Drumheller. Data showing the anchor collar losing lateral capacity under sustained stress, signed off by the engineering team as passed anyway. He spent 5 months of evenings in his garage, deliberately outside the company's systems, so the design's origin would be unambiguous when he brought it forward, using his own materials, his own time, about $8,000 of his own money. He brought it to Kyle Renner, who asked to hold the drawings over a long weekend. When Callum came back, Kyle told him the engineering team found the concept interesting but not commercially viable, and that the company would pursue its own approach. 6 weeks later, the patent Aldred filed as proprietary technology contained every element Callum had developed. When he raised it with Kyle, his building access was deactivated the next morning, and the termination letter arrived by the end of the week. He hadn't pursued it legally because 3 months after his firing, Joanna was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. He had a 4-year-old daughter, a treatment schedule, and a multi-year case against a capitalized corporation with no guarantee of anything. He made the calculation every parent eventually makes, and chose the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. He'd kept one notebook, a green hardcover field book with the original load path sketched in pencil, material calculations in the margins. 2 pages were missing. Torn out the day, Kyle grabbed the notebook and handed it back damaged. Patricia asked to see it. She studied the binding where the pages had been torn, said nothing for a moment, then noted that the transfer document assigning the design to the company carried an electronic signature time-stamped the following Wednesday, 5 days after Callum's credentials had already been deactivated. He couldn't have signed a document from a building he no longer had access to. Renata drove to her father's house that evening and sat with the audit summary over tea she never finished. She'd built her professional identity on trusting her team to manage details while she managed direction, and had told herself for years this was leadership, not negligence. What the summary showed her, page by page, was that the structure she'd trusted had been arranged, by at least one person, to keep her exactly as uninformed as protected him. She wasn't yet certain Callum's account of 12-year-old events was accurate in every particular. Disputed histories can carry selective truth on both sides, but a timestamp doesn't have a perspective. Kyle met her the next morning and made the case of a man who'd concluded that pressing forward was his only option left. That Callum's reappearance the week before the Crowchild milestone wasn't coincidence, that even a credible grievance could be timed for leverage. He asked whether she was really prepared to suspend a city contract and eat the penalty. because a former contractor had dropped an inspection report at a convenient moment. She told him she was still gathering information. That afternoon, she called Callum and proposed a controlled evaluation. If an independent review at Aldred's Balzac test facility found the current Crowchild bracket assembly safe within spec, she'd ask her father to separate the patent dispute from the installation timeline. If it found a material deficiency, she'd act on it regardless of the contract cost. Callum agreed, on the condition that he attend as a technical observer only. He arrived with one handwritten sheet of test parameters, and the Aldred engineers treated his presence with the careful skepticism specialists reserved for outsiders, until an outsider proves he isn't one. Within the first half hour he found it. The assembly's onboard load sensors had been configured to suppress fatigue alerts at a threshold 18% above the original design spec. Not a calibration tweak, a change to the alert logic itself. So the sensor reported the connection stable at readings his original framework would have flagged for inspection. The engineering team called it a field tuning adjustment to reduce false positives during high wind events. Callum went to the whiteboard and wrote 3 numbers: the lateral load at which the anchor collar began accumulating micro-fracture stress, the load at which the primary connection failed without the secondary path, and the gap between the suppressed alert threshold and the point of failure under asymmetric stress, 11%. He asked for the Crowchild sensor logs from the past 3 weeks. 4 separate high-wind events, 12 to 40 minutes each, in which the suppressed sensor had crossed the real threshold without alerting anyone. The authorization on the threshold change belonged to Kyle Renner. By the next morning, a version of events had reached 2 construction trade outlets and 1 Calgary business publication. Callum Briggs, terminated contractor, pursuing a decade-old grievance through an unauthorized site inspection, now demanding $11 million for work under a contract already settled. No named sources, no allegation of crime. Just a frame sturdy enough to start doing damage the way reputational pressure damages small independent consultants. 2 longtime project managers sent carefully worded emails, pausing referrals. A professional association quietly dropped his listing. A lender asked in writing for confirmation the dispute wouldn't affect his loan payments. None of it was accidental, and Callum understood its shape well enough to know it hadn't started with a journalist. A separate message arrived through someone calling himself a project communications advisor. The offer was simple. The check already authorized would be reissued under a settlement stripped of Callum's conditions, the patent matter closed outside the public record, no further inquiry into the design's history, in exchange for a full confidentiality agreement and no attempt to attach his name to any filing connected to the integrated load frame. Callum read it twice, forwarded it to Patricia, and called Nadie. She was in the school library, her voice carrying the studied steadiness of a teenager, trying not to sound more frightened than she was. She'd already been tracking the coverage. She asked if they'd lose the contract work. He told her honestly that the pressure was real, and that he could end it in 24 hours by signing what he'd just been offered. She asked why he wasn't signing. He told her 26 bridges were still carrying public traffic on a bracket assembly missing the safety component he'd built specifically to stop the failure mode already showing up in the Crowchild logs. He signed away his voice while that stayed true, and something failed. On a bridge in Saskatoon on a windy afternoon, on a walkway in Winnipeg during a community event, this conversation would be the one he couldn't undo. Nadie went quiet long enough that he checked the signal. Then she said she understood. It was more than he'd expected her to say, and it cost him something to hear. The way being understood by someone you love can cost more than being argued with. Douglas issued a public statement the next day. The payment under discussion originated from an independent audit, was unrelated to the Crowchild inspection, and reflected a contractual obligation the company had failed to honor for years. It didn't kill the story, but it broke its worst implication. The board convened an emergency committee to review whether Douglas had overstepped his authority commissioning the audit. Technically within his rights as founding shareholder, but framed by several members as a unilateral move around governance. Kyle backed the committee with visible enthusiasm. That evening, an anonymous file landed in Callum's inbox, an audio recording from an internal engineering meeting 12 years earlier, a voice matching Kyle Renner's giving explicit instructions: strip the secondary load path from the commercial spec before fabrication, and reclassify the originating document as internal development rather than contractor submission so it wouldn't raise a rights question at filing. No message, just the file, from an account created 6 hours before. Patricia had the metadata independently verified, recorded on a device logged into Aldred's internal network on a date consistent with the original filing period, the voice print sufficient for evidentiary use. 4 days later, a handwritten letter arrived at Callum's house from Bernard Ossie, 63, a retired senior test systems engineer. He wrote that he'd been in the room when Kyle tore the pages from Callum's notebook and filed them separately while HR walked Callum out. He'd said nothing then. 2 daughters in university, a mortgage in Airdrie, a pension he couldn't risk. He'd told himself for 12 years the record would surface on its own. Seeing Callum's name in the coverage had made that argument impossible to keep believing. Callum drove to Airdrie that Thursday. Bernard was waiting at the door before he knocked. Neither man made it easy. Callum listened to all of it, then told him the anger was real, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise, and that coming forward now was still the right thing to do, regardless of what it cost either of them. Bernard told him where the missing pages were, filed by Kyle under a decommissioned 2011 project code, in a storage facility in Balzac, invisible to any search using Callum's name or the patent number. Renata and Patricia drove out the next morning and found the box exactly where Bernard said. Behind a folder of obsolete test schedules were 6 pages of graph-ruled paper in Callum's handwriting, dated 14 months before his contract with Aldred had even begun. The integrated load frame had existed before the contract. It had never legitimately belonged to anyone but him. Renata scheduled the structural evaluation for the following Monday, through the city's infrastructure safety office rather than Aldred's internal channels, and invited 3 parties who'd never been in a room together. The structural safety officer from Alberta Transportation and Economic Corridors, the city's infrastructure contract lead, and Callum. She told Kyle only that she was running a mandatory pre-installation safety confirmation. True and unobjectionable without leaving a paper trail of the objection. The test ran on a full-scale rig at Balzac, simulating combined lateral and vertical loading with automatic shutoffs calibrated to trip well before any real damage. Callum stood off to one side with a tablet of live load data. His submitted protocol called for 3 simultaneous conditions: sustained high load, lateral wind equivalent force above 40 kilometers an hour, and deliberate failure of the primary bracket sensor, replicating exactly what he'd flagged at Crowchild. The first 2 conditions ran without objection. The third needed Renata's written authorization. She gave it. 7 minutes in, the primary sensor was cut. In Callum's original design, the secondary load path would have engaged within 3 seconds, rerouting lateral force through the anchor collar while the primary connection recovered. In the current commercial spec, there was no secondary path. Only the suppressed alert threshold, silently crossed, and a load model trying to manage lateral stress through a single connection never meant to carry it alone. The number on the monitor climbed steadily past everything Callum had chalked on the whiteboard 9 days earlier, until the automatic shutoff tripped at 112% of rated capacity. 16 points past where an alert should have fired. 23 past where the secondary path would have engaged. No structure was damaged. No one was at risk. The test had been built to guarantee both, but the number needed no interpretation from anyone in the room. Callum held up a machined steel anchor plate the size of his palm. $47 a unit, times 26 bridges, against a build cost saving of about the same amount per structure, and said one person had decided to cut it, and the same person had authorized suppressing the alerts that would have caught the consequence. Kyle, standing near the equipment rack at an angle that avoided eye contact, said the change order had gone through standard approval with the COO listed as final authority. Renata had signed it. She had, 4 years earlier, one line item among 38 in a quarterly cost review package built for rapid executive sign-off, each item pre-vetted by her team. The signature was real. Her understanding of what she'd signed was not. Standing in front of the monitor, she understood how thin that distinction looked from where the Alberta Transportation Officer and the city's representative were standing. She told the three of them plainly that she'd signed it, that she hadn't read it carefully enough to understand what it did, and that this wasn't a defense. It was an accurate description of how a safety-critical change had been buried inside a process built to minimize exactly the scrutiny that would have caught it. She'd built that process. She wasn't going to use Kyle's conduct as cover for her own failure. Callum let her finish, then said, without emphasis, that the line between a mistake made in negligence and a decision made in bad faith wasn't mainly a question of blame. Regulators would sort that out in their own time. It was a question of what a person did the moment the mistake became visible to them. He'd watched her look at that number. He'd seen it register. The case against Kyle Renner moved fast, backed by Patricia's audit trail, Bernard's sworn statement, the pre-contract pages, the recording, the forged signature metadata, and the censor authorization bearing his name. Within 48 hours, his access was suspended and his credentials pulled. The board convened to decide whether Renata would stay. Some argued her signature and years of failing to catch Kyle's conduct were a governance failure no reform could fix. Others argued that everything she'd done since learning the truth, suspending the installation, ordering the independent test, owning her failure in front of the city's own representative, was exactly the judgment the company needed to keep. Douglas stayed silent until the vote, then said she'd made the right call at the moment it cost the most, and he'd vote accordingly. 6-3. Renata took the call in the parking garage because she didn't trust her face in a hallway. 2 weeks later, the board reconvened for a formal recorded session. Callum arrived straight from a site visit in Cochrane, still in his work clothes, and set one item on the table without preamble, the original $275 invoice, still unpaid. He told the board he hadn't come to argue for or against Renata Voss staying. They were better positioned to judge that than he was. What he wanted to say was simpler. That invoice had set everything in motion, not because of its size, but because of the reasoning behind refusing it, the assumption that the man in the worn boots with an inspection report wasn't worth a proper response. That contempt was the variable that had changed everything, because it had put his name in a contractor file a founder had been searching for across 8 months and 3 dead ends. He also said Renata had made serious errors, signing what she hadn't read, extending trust without verification, letting a fraud run for over a decade, while she managed from strategy instead of substance. He wasn't there to minimize any of that. But she'd also been the first person in Aldred's leadership to halt a $40 million city contract. The moment she had evidence the product was structurally unsound, with a compliance officer in the room and a penalty clock running. That mattered, not as an erasure of what came before it, but as evidence of the one quality a leader most needs: choosing the harder, correct action over the easier, convenient one in the moment when nobody could make her. He proposed an independent technical safety committee with binding authority to certify every structural specification before installation, not advisory, and not overridable by executive sign-off, and that Renata keep her role on condition she accept that limit in writing, alongside a formal channel for engineers to escalate safety concerns directly to the committee outside the management chain. He added that the committee would need people who understood how these systems actually failed in the field, and that he knew a retired test engineer in Airdrie who owed the industry a few honest years. The board adopted it with minor amendments. Before the session closed, Renata opened her folder and wrote a personal check, her own money, not the company's, for $300, and slid it across to sit beside the invoice. The extra $25, she said, was for the time he'd spent waiting. Callum folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket, then folded the $275 invoice the same way and set it beside it. The $11 million check Douglas had brought to his kitchen table 3 weeks earlier still sat unsigned on his desk. The revised settlement took 9 days to draft, and 5 more for Callum to review with an attorney he hired himself, someone with no prior connection to anyone in the room. It carried 3 conditions, each required before the payment would be considered final. First, formal restoration of his name as sole inventor on the integrated load frame patent and every derivative filing, amended with the Canadian Intellectual Property Office within 60 days. Second, a funded safety retrofit of all 26 installed structures still missing the secondary load path, inspected and repaired at no cost to the municipalities involved, completed within 24 months. Third, an independently governed engineering protection fund, seeded with $1.5 million, to support engineers and consultants who report structural safety concerns through proper channels and face retaliation for it. Douglas signed as founding shareholder, Renata signed as COO. The figure on the instrument was $11 million. Callum used part of it to retire his equipment financing, finally renovate the workshop he'd been putting off for 4 years, and found the Briggs Structural Standards Institute, a small independent shop doing third-party safety verification for bridge and modular infrastructure, staffed by engineers chosen for competence and an uncompromising record on reporting. Bernard Ossie joined as senior analyst, his testimony now part of the public record, and spent his first 2 months co-writing a case study on the Crowchild failure mode that 2 Canadian engineering faculties later added to their curricula. The Crowchild connector was finished with the secondary load path restored and passed certification well above the original benchmarks. A load frame that didn't fatigue under asymmetric stress turned out to carry more reliably and for longer than one made brittle by a $47 shortcut. Renata started showing up at Callum's office on the odd Saturday morning, not for contracts, but because she'd asked him to teach her to read a load report the way a field engineer does, starting from the anomaly instead of the summary, trusting the raw numbers before the interpretation. He was patient. She worked harder at it than he expected. Nadie was in the kitchen making coffee the afternoon the amended patent certificate arrived, framed at Callum's request. She read her father's name in the inventor line for a long moment before she spoke. The settlement had changed things for them in ways she hadn't let herself imagine, she told him, and that mattered more than she had words for. But it was the name on that certificate, just his name, where it should have been all along, that let the last 12 years finally make sense. Not easier, not erased, just honest. And sometimes that's the only kind of resolution that actually holds. The $275 had been the price at which the truth finally got paid. Everything after it was just the interest.